So good morning. It's time to start. If you didn't grab a lesson sheet in the back, there may still be a few back there. I'll point out that it's a bit confusing because the lesson sheets have last week's lessons on one side and this week's lesson with Bathsheba was on the back side. So you don't have to have those to participate, but if you want one, they're back there. And then the last lesson in this quarter for this class is next Sunday night. And those sheets are also in the back. It's Queen Esther will be the last lesson. So as I said, we're talking about the influence of a woman. And some of the things we've been noting in the class is how influential women are, especially in the lives of men. We've been looking at the Old Testament accounts of these stories, and we've been doing some speculation because the Bible text isn't inclusive of all the details that we would probably like to have, and that's certainly the case today. We've all, over our lives, read the account of David and Bathsheba. We've probably heard sermons on the topic and been in Bible classes, possibly even read some books. It's a very familiar story. And because of all that background we've had, I think sometimes we fill in the gaps that we don't have the details to with some speculation, which in this class we've done a lot of speculation. There's no problems with that, except that we need to make sure we're making the distinction of what the text tells us and where the speculation starts. So I'd ask that as we read this short account, there's only 5 verses really that tell the story, that we look at just the facts at first, and then we can save our speculation beyond that once we've established what the Bible account is precisely. Okay? So the text for this morning, 2 Samuel chapter 11, 1 through 5. And we find at this time, this is late in the life of King David. And we've seen the last 3 or 4 lessons, early life of David, the women in his life early on, and then at this point, David is well established as the king of both combined Israel and Judah. He's got his palace there in Jerusalem, and he's pretty well entrenched himself. And you can tell from these verses that he's gotten a bit comfortable, it seems. So let me just read these first 5 verses, and then we can make sure we all agree on the facts of the story and go through the lesson material. So this is 2 Samuel chapter 11, starting in verse 1. Then it happened in the spring, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed at Jerusalem. Now when evening came, David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And David sent messengers and took her. And when she came to him, he lay with her. Now she had purified herself from her uncleanness. She returned to her house. And the woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said, "I am pregnant." Okay. So just a very short account of what happened. So just to hit the highlights, springtime when the kings go out to war, David didn't. He stayed in Jerusalem. In the evening, he goes out. He got out of his bed and went to the roof. From the roof, he could see a woman in somewhere near residence, and she was bathing, and it said she was beautiful. So David takes action. First thing, he asked who she was. That's in verse 3. Someone told him that it's Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And David's response was, never heard of him? It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that David had any reaction at all to finding out it was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Does David know who Uriah is? Eric says yes. How do we know that? That's right. Uriah was no stranger to David. What's the relationship between David and Uriah the Hittite? So, throughout the years, David's come from a young soldier, and he's advanced in Saul's army, and he's done these great acts of bravery, fighting the Philistines, fighting God's enemies. He's had a close group of allies, other men with him throughout this time, through the wilderness in the wilderness. And he's got this group, and it's called David's Mighty Men. And there's a top 3 that are ranked, and there's a top 30 that are ranked, and there's a top 37, these different groups that are David's closest allies who have been with him through all this. And Uriah the Hittite is one of those men. So we can read about those guys in 2 Samuel 23. There's an accounting of all these men, and it lists them all. Uriah the Hittite was one of these mighty men that David kept as his closest allies. So that may explain why it seems Uriah's house was so near the palace, because there was a relationship here between David and Uriah. Does that change the story a little bit to know that this was a friend, a trusted comrade of David? It does to me. I never paid much attention to that when I read the story in the past. But when David heard this is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, it seems like for a lot of people that would have been the end of it. What's that, Gail? Hands off. Okay. But that's not what David does. So his first action, once he saw her, was to find out who she was. Next, he has servants to go and bring her to him. And that's done. And then he lay with her, is the way my account says that. And then he sends her on her way. So those are his actions based on him seeing her in the first place. To round it out, she realizes she's pregnant, and she sends word to David. Okay. So is that the facts? Is there anything else that's been skipped or important that we need to discuss from the text? Okay. Seems like that's going to cover it. So with that said, let's go through our lesson sheet and go through this table. There's 2 columns today. The first column is for the text we just read. So we'll go through there. And we'll do the next column shortly. What's the relationship with the influenced individual? What's that? What's that? Oh, what page? The page with Bathsheba, first column. What's the relationship between the two? There's none. They're strangers at this point. Okay? So if they're strangers, the second question, was the relationship between the two short-term or long-term? Well, there was none. So this one doesn't apply. Overall result of the influence here for David, is this positive or negative? Negative? Okay. What was the method of influence? And it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on this. And some might even argue that this is not truly influence. But what was the method of Bathsheba's influence on David here? She didn't do anything. Why was he moved to action then? Okay, because of his lust. But on her part of this, she was just visible to him, right? He saw her and lusted after her, and then he takes action from there. So, in all these other lessons, we've talked about the influence of a woman. Is this truly influence in the classic sense of having influence over somebody? Raul shakes his head no. Anybody agree with that? Disagree? Comments? Amanda? Okay. Okay, it's influence, Amanda says, but not intentional. And we've seen that previously, like with Ruth, right? Ruth was influential with Boaz, and she never intended to be, but by her actions, she had come to be known by him, and it changed his behavior. It made him behave probably a little better than he would have otherwise. That was influence without an intention. Here, potentially, she had no intention, and yet it changes his behavior. So that could be considered influence, but you could argue, well, she had no control over his actions. So it's first Raul and then Eric. Deliberate, right? Okay. Okay. Took no effort for Bathsheba. Okay. All right, Eric. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yep. Okay. So Eric brings up a good point, and one I wanted to discuss is we don't know if she had intention or not. The Bible doesn't give us any indication that she was tempting him on purpose, but it's a strange situation, and people have always wondered about whether or not this was some kind of attempt or was perhaps just carelessness. So I have some more comments on that, but let me pick up some of these. Amanda first, and then Eric. Right? Does not say Ruth, right? Right. Right. Okay. Okay. And then, oh yeah, go ahead, man. Keep going. So, all good points. There's a lot of unknowns here. I have a few comments on that, but let's get Eric's first. After dark, right? He was up in the evening. He had gotten out of his bed. Okay. So let me point out a few things that I did find out, and it may help us, and it may muddy the water further, so to speak. In the account, it does say, in my version, in verse 4, and it's confusing here what different versions will say in verse 4 about she had purified herself from her uncleanness. Is that a parenthetical statement in anyone else's, or is that just part of the verse? Okay. Parenthetical in some, it's part of the verse in others. This is a New American Standard, and it reads very differently here when it says, and he lay with her, and when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. The way this reads, it sounds like it was he lay with her, and then she purified herself, and then she went home. The original text says, in parentheses, she had purified herself from her uncleanness, referring to her bathing in the first place. If that's the case, And commentators believe that's more accurate. That this purification is talking about was the bathing she had done that he had witnessed in the first place. 1 second, Roll. The purification for women at this time, after menstruation, was to bathe in a ceremonial way. And anytime you had uncleanness and washing required for that, women, men, whatever the uncleanness was, you had to use waters that weren't artificially gathered. So in a city like Jerusalem, you couldn't bring in pots of water from the river to do this in your home. You could go out to the river because that water in the river was not artificially gathered, but you could collect water from rain in a courtyard that could be used for ceremonial cleansing. And the speculation is that's what she had done. Living in town, they used rainwater collected without moving any pots around for this purpose. And so she was out at night trying to do this ceremonial cleansing, and David happened to see something. So that puts the element of doubt in the story about whether or not she was careless or intentionally trying to tempt him. It's just not real clear because we don't have all the details. And then who had was it Raul had another comment? Right. No, it's believed this is the ceremony. So he's asking, was this the ceremonial cleansing that you read about in Deuteronomy from some kind of discharge, or this just a regular bath? And commentators tend to believe it was the menstruation cycle. 7 days after that is complete, you do this ceremonial cleansing. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So it all goes back to what's in verse 4. And was it after David and her had laid together, or referring back to her original bath? So all that said, and all the speculation we might want to do, the important thing I think here is David saw her. Whatever the circumstances, he saw her. And from there, he begins to take action. So with that in mind, let's continue to answer these questions and see what we can gather from this for our use. So method of influence, we answered, he saw her and thought she was beautiful. The impact of the influence, what was the impact? Sin. Okay. Right. Example. Yep. Okay. Okay. Okay, so Eric compares David here to Joseph, because Joseph's example was sin presented itself to him, and he removed himself from the situation. David here, just the opportunity, and he goes all in. He's committed to this. Two very opposite reactions. And I would compare David here more to Samson. You remember, Samson sees a Philistine girl that looks good to him. All he knows is what he sees, and he tells his parents, I want her, get her for me. And you see where that led Samson as well. This is David seeing a woman, says, I want her, she looks good to me. To his servants, go get her for me. Very similar to me in Samson. Laverne? Okay, well, there's a lot of bad things, but his treatment of Uriah is what stands out to you, because that's what's going to happen. As a result of this initial sin, he's going to continue to sin to the point where he's going to betray his trusted friend. Okay. So you can say after impact of the influence, well, David is moved to act. It is sin. There's an affair. There's a child born. Uriah is killed. A child died. All these things are related. Now, I didn't include, if you would concede that Bathsheba influenced David just by being seen, I take that influence just this far, verse 5. Once he knows she's pregnant, to me, that's one incident. Moving forward, David's reaction, trying to hide his sin, I think is totally unrelated to seeing Bathsheba. Now he's just trying to cover his tracks. And so all these other things, I don't put in the same, I didn't include those verses in this. It seems to me influence of Bathsheba has already had an effect. And now he's just acting to save his own face. So that's why I'm limiting to these first 5 verses. But the influence, the impact is what we see carrying on that's so dramatic. Okay, was the influence a result of a conscious effort? No. We said no. This is something from the scripture we can't tell. This is an effort by Bathsheba. It seems to me this just happened. Or was it carelessness? Was she being careful? But it wasn't something conscious. James? Okay. So she believes that Bathsheba could have been more careful. What about the moment that David's servant knock on her door? Does she have the opportunity there to stop this? Is there any responsibility on Bathsheba once the servants of David come to her? This is speculation again, but I can't help but getting into this since we're talking about it. Laverne first.
What would he have done if he had said no?
Could the one of David's subjects, her husband's away, mind you, she's home alone, knock on the door, it's David's servants saying, you need to come with us. Does she have the ability to say, no, I'm staying home? No, it's really not an option. This is very much so far, well, at this point, at that instant, she didn't really have a choice. She's going with these men that David sent. And I'm sure they didn't say, hey, come with us. David wants to lay with you. I'm sure that's not part of the message that was sent. Once she arrives in David's palace and David comes to her, does she have the opportunity there to stop this? Speculation. Anyone want to try to speculate on that? Rob says yes. Okay.
She has the opportunity to resist what's going on.
She could have physically fought back. Okay, is that likely in this society with a king? I mean, it is possible, but it doesn't seem like a realistic expectation at this point. In fact, I would consider this to be rape, because she didn't have any power aside from her physical strength, which wasn't really going to work in this situation. In today's society, when a boss has an affair with a subordinate, is that considered okay because she had a choice? Bosses have power in today's society, and that's viewed by society as part of the situation you're confronted with. Well, when the king had this kind of power back then, if she had wanted to resist, it would have been very difficult. And I don't know that it's realistic to expect that. Oh, okay, Jeff first, and then Gail, and then Eric. Jeff?
Well, she could have used her power just like that.
Okay.
To sway me to do something.
Yeah, we looked at Abigail last week, and she confronted David and prevented him when he was set, he had taken a vow to sin, and she stopped it. So, okay, so then why didn't Bathsheba use those same skills? And then Gail next.
Well, sex is way different from the other.
Okay.
that we're talking about.
Okay.
And he is already lustful.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't say she was on her roof. It says he was on his roof.
Right.
She may have been in his first courtyard, and he was looking down on her. And so, there's just some things that trying to blame her.
Okay.
When you think about Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, I mean, how much? There's way so many things that women do not. And this is something I've had a problem with from the get-go, with the way our attitude toward women in that time. We think in our heads, and we relate it to our culture. There were few women that had power, very few. And the rest of them did what they were told. They were married off, they didn't have any choices about anything. They starved to death, their children starved, if their husbands left her, and there was nobody to take care of them. So when we try to shift blame to a woman that's in this position, even if she were a tiny bit compliant, really, I mean, look at the power here, and look at the subservience of women in that time.
Right.
So we get caught up thinking in our culture, and I think we're messed up.
Okay. There was someone else who had a comment too. Eric.
Yeah, you say some evidence that you have about how this would play out. One line of what they were saying was the rape of Tamar. One of the biggest authors of a very sort of story
Mm-hmm.
where his son Amnon lusts for Tamar, sister Bathsheba. Lusts for Tamar, brings her in, and she reasons with him, saying, "This is not right.
Don't do this.
No, David, he would not do this." And yet he still forces himself on her. So, there she had no reason to say she screamed, it doesn't say she cried. She knew it was wrong, but it looked like she knew she had no other choice. So that she was even more so in a position of not.
Okay. Okay. Good. Rob, did you have a comment? So, yeah.
Rob has never been a woman.
So yeah, like I said, there's a lot of strong feelings on this, and there's a lot of speculation. We don't have a lot of details. Let's just move to this, because I can see this is going to be something that continues to be difficult to agree on. But what does the Bible say about David's actions here? Sin or not sin? Sin. What does the Bible say about Bathsheba's action? There's no condemnation. There's no comments at all. Okay. So based on that, I think we just need to remind ourselves anything else is speculation. It may be good speculation, but it's speculation. I'm cautious to go further than that. One more comment. Vashti, Queen Vashti.
She stood her ground and said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not happy.
Yeah, she did. Yeah, that's right. And she suffered because of it. And it still wasn't the exact same situation, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's keep moving, because there's a whole other column to get to if time will allow. Where did we leave off? David wasn't aware. David would have been better off or worse off without the influence. Well, if we're saying that the influence was just seeing her, he would have been better not having seen her. But as Eric points out, what were David's options? He's seen her. Okay, that's happened. What were his options? Well, he could have followed Joseph's example and just ended it. I mean, he just walked away. That's all that would have been required to end this whole situation. But he takes the step to find out who she was. He finds out who she was. That should have been a full stop at that point. He goes further. He sends for her anyway. When he gets her there, he has sex with her. Okay, so he keeps taking actions to propagate this. Okay, so the speculation here, what would have been the result of the situation without the influence? If he had never seen her, what's the result? He wouldn't have committed murder? Okay.
He wouldn't have had that curse of, the sword throughout his household and all the sorrow that he's
Okay, so Melanie points out that, as part of this judgment from God about this incident, there's a curse on his household that he's going to have this turmoil among his family. And that's true, because that resulted directly from this. But was David's household otherwise in good shape? Is David going to serve God 100% except for this instance? God's going to continue to punish David for stuff like taking a survey of all the population of Judah and Israel. He told him not to do that. David does it anyway. God condemns him there. There's punishment there. David keeps making horrible mistakes. But he does go to God and accepts God's judgment and tries to make amends. So it's uncertain. Certainly that curse wouldn't have been here, but it's uncertain if he still wouldn't have had problems in his household. He doesn't discipline his children. And that's constantly brought out in these stories. So again, we speculate it's really hard to know what would have happened. But certainly Uriah wouldn't have died, and it would have been better for David had he not seen Bathsheba in the first place. Okay, let's try to do some takeaways here. What can we take away from this that would value us? One thing I want to point out, the obvious here, is that the appearance of women is very impactful to men. Okay, I think women are aware of how impactful that is. But if you ever forget, think about David, what he was willing to do because the lust of the eye. He was willing to kill a close friend. That's kind of hard to put in the life of David, that he's so easily swaying. I asked this question about Solomon, about Samson too. Is this realistic that a man would react this way to seeing a woman? Or is there more to this that we're not seeing here? Or is this just a kind of a story thrown into the Bible to get our attention? Because this doesn't seem like it could really happen. Is this really possible? Okay. So everyone seems to agree this is. It is that powerful. So if women's beauty, women's bodies are that influential to men, then how should we behave? Cautiously. Okay, that's right. Right. Okay. Well, so what Eric is saying is that the men have a responsibility as much as the women, right? When it comes to how influential women can be. So the women need to be cautious and be aware of how influential that is. The men also have to be aware of how that affects them and behave in a way that's not like David, just like Joseph. Raul? Okay. Yeah, and men and women, that's true. Men and women, though, are created differently and respond differently. And I think men, much more so than women, are responding to visual stimulus. Okay. Raul thinks that. Okay. Let's do a real quick thought question because we're running out of time again. Who was at fault for the sin in this instance? And we've been talking about this a lot. David is responsible, and I refer you to 1 Corinthians 10, 12, and 13 about temptation. And God has not given us any temptation that's not common to man and has provided a way of escape. What was David's way of escape? Just walk away. I mean, there's so many opportunities for David to stop this. And so clearly David is condemned. Bathsheba, depending on how you read the story and how you speculate, has some responsibility here. I see it mostly as David in this instance. Okay, but all that said, let's move over, because we're running out of time, to the next column, and we're going to move up to 1 Kings chapter 1 and see, Bathsheba doesn't go away. Everything that happens, her husband being killed, I don't know if David even ever told her about how Uriah died. It's hard for me to imagine he tells her that story and then she stays, but she is still with David as his wife at the end of King David's life. Okay, we get to 1 Kings chapter 1. David is an old man. He's not doing anything. He just stays in his room, in his bed, with this young woman keeping him warm. The problem with that is his oldest son is taking matters into his own hands because he sees David as weak. So Adonijah, let me skip over there, the oldest son is made himself a feast. He's aligned himself with David's chief military commander. He's aligned himself with the chief priest and all the other sons of David to acknowledge Adonijah. He's going to be the next king. What's the problem with that? What's the main problem with that? Is he been selected by David to be the next king? That's right. Okay. As well, that's right, yeah. So he's using all kinds of techniques to be the obvious heir to the throne, but he's not the one that's been selected. Solomon has been selected. But David has taken no action on that. And he's so old and feeble, he's not about to take any action. He just wants to stay in his room and stay warm, apparently. So Nathan the prophet steps back in. We've seen Nathan before. There is a problem that Nathan thinks needs to be addressed. And so instead of going to David, because Nathan didn't feel like he was capable of going to David in a time of crisis to intervene. Is that true about Nathan? Nathan is very capable of going to David to address very sensitive items. And he's done it before. The whole sin with Bathsheba was totally brought to David's attention by Nathan through God's direction. But in this case, Nathan doesn't want to go by himself. What does he want to happen? How does he want to address this problem with David? He needs Bathsheba to take a role in this, which is very interesting because Nathan, like I said, is capable of doing a lot, but he feels like he needs the influence of Bathsheba to address this. Why? What is the purpose of bringing her into this? It's her son who's supposed to be the king, right?
And it kind of implies that Bathsheba still has,
She does. It seems like she is, to this day, still very influential with him. Is she in danger right now with this? Yeah, Solomon and her are probably going to be killed if the other son becomes king. So that's a factor as well. But Nathan goes to her, and Nathan's plan is, look, Bathsheba, here's what's going on. You go to David first, and you tell him what's happening. And then I'll come in separately while you're talking, and I'll back you up. And then you'll make this appeal to David to take action. Okay, so that's exactly what happens in this instance. She comes to David. She bows down. He asks immediately, what is it that you want? So she tells him what she wants. He's made an oath to her that Solomon would be the next king. What is Bathsheba's name? Do y'all know? Raul? What does Bathsheba mean? Daughter of an oath is what her name means. And oaths keep coming up in her lives. Even Adonijah, once it's obvious Solomon's going to be the king, he goes to her and begs her to make an oath on his behalf. It's interesting how her name plays into this. But David has made an oath to her that Solomon will be the king. She reminds him of this. Nathan comes in to back her up, right according to the plan. When he does, she apparently leaves the room. Nathan explains what's happened. David calls her back in and there says, okay, I am going to take action today. We'll go ahead and anoint Solomon publicly so that everyone knows what David's wishes are about the next king. Okay. Anything I left out of that summary? Okay. Real quick, we have maybe 4 minutes to go through the column here. So now, what's the relationship with the influenced individual? Wife, that's right. Was the relationship now long-term or short-term? Long-term. Overall result of this instance, positive or negative? Positive influence here. What was the method she used? Direct request, okay. She was very direct in this case. Guilt. Okay, so guilt because of how she was treated and reminding about the oath. Do you think he still had affection for her after all these years? I think that's what Nathan, that's part of the reason he's doing this. He knows David loves her still. I mean, after all that's happened, they had a relationship somehow, and he comforts her at the death of that first son. There is an intimacy here, and I think that's maintained. And I think that's part of this, is Nathan is drawing upon this intimacy they have, these good feelings, and the fact that David's responsible for a lot in her life, and he has made an oath. Okay, so what's the impact of this? Positive, but what happens precisely here? Solomon does get to become king. Okay, it's going to work out. Was the influence the result of a conscious effort? Yes, it was. It was all planned out. Sometimes our interactions, we have to be careful, and this is one of those examples. They planned exactly how this was going to go to maximize their influence with David. It's not a trick, and it's not dishonest to plan out what you're going to say to somebody in an important situation, and that's what's happening here. Was this instance part of a larger pattern? We don't really know. It's possible. She seemed like she knew exactly how to handle the situation. We don't have any other Bible stories that give us that information. Would David have been better off or worse off without the influence? Well, worse, because David's wishes wouldn't have been carried out. And the speculation here, what would have been the result without the influence? Adonijah would be king? Is that what you said? Yeah. It seems like he had it all in place. Everything was going his way. He was the next oldest living son, at least. He had the military. He had the priest. He had all of David's other sons on board. This probably could have worked, but it doesn't work out because of the influence of Bathsheba. Any takeaways from this part? Laverne? No. Question, okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If God had already chosen him, the other guy would have built the temple.
Okay, so you're saying since God was already on board with Solomon, that no matter what would have happened with Bathsheba, it would have worked out. And that's probably true. We've seen that before in other stories where we're going to see Queen Esther next week. If not, if you don't take action, God's still going to accomplish his will. It'll just be through somebody else. And that's possible because you're right. There was that agreement already. But one of the takeaways I put is we can be careful on how we maximize our influence. So that's something that we notice here. And certainly Bathsheba over time had learned how to do that with David, how to maximize influence. Okay, we're out of time. We're past. So thanks. And then next week, Queen Esther.